already talked to my brother.
She also helps other women.
I met Andy.
See my brother.
Andy's wife.
The table's backwards, so like I gotta be this far away anyway.
Good morning, everybody.
I mean, I'm in the same position. I'm not that far away.
I'm a lot bigger than you are.
We're waiting.
He rose between two thorns.
September.
I think that's
A
comfortable.
little bit of a fall feel outside, and I'm ready for it. Did you? So good for us to be together this morning. If you haven't picked up a bulletin yet, you can get one later on. I think we're out in here. Ron, Carol, good to have y'all in here with us this morning. Hunter, always glad to have folks visiting our class. Lacey, I often say that if you visit twice, I put you on roll, then you're not a visitor anymore. So, Bill celebrates a birthday this week, right?
Yes, sir.
Probably about 49, I guess.
Yes, sir. And holding.
We're all 49, Bill.
Hey, hush your mouth. Draw.
You're 39.
Yeah, look up. No, I ain't hit that yet. Not medicated.
I guess
I'm on Medicare.
I sometimes tell people that my class in here ranges in age from folks in high school up to folks in their 90s.
There
If you fit somewhere in between there, we'll welcome you, and if you don't, we'll welcome you. It is good for us to be together. I don't have anything really to add to the announcement that you'll find. Several people continue to be on our prayer list. Many of them have been there for some time, and there's a few that's been added. Andy, we're glad that your procedure went well so far. We'll pray that things will continue to be okay for you. So anything else? What else do we have to make mention of today?
Bill has a new grandbaby.
Yeah, say it again.
Bill has a new grandbaby.
Well,
born
congratulations.
Wednesday,
How
number
many does that make?
8.
Number 8.
8. You got 3 on me then.
He's got another one coming.
Say, she's got one coming.
We both. He has another
Let's try to
one
pick
next
up
week.
Well, there
Next
you go.
week? Next week, all right.
Very good. Congratulations. Those things that's good news. Anything else? Tucker, good to have you with us. We must be down in class somewhere. We've got some business.
The classroom is, I think Zane must not be here.
Okay. Well, you're always welcome in here. Okay, so we're going to continue a study today, a topical study that I didn't tell you the name of it last week, but I put it up on the board today. It's to study eschatology. That's a big old word, but it's really a word that means the study or the science of last things. So as you begin to talk about last days, and that's what we really introduced our study last week, then eschatology, that's what we'll be talking about today. So I guess we have to revive our youngest in the class on down.
3 weeks.
So
Or 3 months.
We'll
3 months. Months.
from diapers to whatever.
She said diapers to diapers. I mean, if it did.
Terry?
Good for us to be together, and we're here to study the Bible. So let's get right into that. And, Brian, word of prayer.
No, Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to learn more about you and about your word, Lord. Pray that you'll continue to be with each and every one of us in here. Help us to have an open mind today and be with Glenn and be with him and help him to deliver what he's prepared for this lesson today. Lord, be with all of us in this class, be with our families. Continue to bless us. Christ, let me pray. Amen.
Amen, sir. Okay, as I stated last week, we introduced a topic here of the study of the last days, and noted that we have a lot said about that, social media and friends and what have you, and so we're going to wind up in Matthew 24 today, I promise you, because that's where we headed last week, and we really never got very far into it, but we'll get more into that study here today. But I do want to make mention of just a few things in the way of introduction. I encountered this week something that was new to me, and some of you may have heard it before, but the name of it is the Millennial Day Theory. Now let me describe what it is, and like I said, it was kind of new to me. A family member posted it online, and basically what it says is that the earth is about 6,000 years old. That I believe, if you believe the Bible, the biblical account, the chronology, probably about 6,000 years old. Well, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, we have a reference that 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years to God. You also find the reference similar to that over in Psalm 90, verse 4. The idea of 1,000 years being equivalent to a day. Those are the only two passages that would support the Millennial Day Theory. But the Millennial Day Theory says that, okay, if the earth is 6,000 years old, then we're very near the end of the sixth day if 1,000 years equals a day. Okay? 6,000 years. And in the 6 days of creation, at the end of the 6 days, God had created everything, and then the seventh day was a day of rest, the Sabbath rest. So the Millennial Day Theory says that we're very near, we're at the very end of the 6 days, and we're about to enter that seventh day, 1,000 years of rest for the child of God, okay? So it was interesting to me. I mean, I read what supposedly had happened or happened during that first 1,000 years, the second 1,000 years, what happened on the third day is the third 1,000 years, etc. So anyway, I just
what religion would that have come from?
Pardon me?
Do you know what religion that was? Like what this person?
Oh, it's absolutely.
Like Church of Christ?
No.
That's what I'm saying. What was the religion that thought
it
this?
It would be a large part of the religious world today that subscribes to premillennialism. I had never heard that particular aspect of it, but it fits right in with this, in that the second coming of Christ is supposed to happen very soon. We're talking about the things that happened in the last days. Let me ask you this: are we living in the last days? Can you look around and see the things that's going on, and can you say that we're living in the last days? Not based on what we're seeing going on, but are we living in the last days? The answer to that, yes. Why do I say that? Because on Pentecost, when Peter began to preach, and he referenced the fact that what you see here today on Pentecost, he said, was spoken by the prophet Joel, which was 800 years earlier than that. And Joel said, in the last days, this is what will happen. And so Peter said, what you see here is what was said by Joel to say, this is the last day. So are we living in the last days? Yes. Those last days started on Pentecost. And what that simply means is that this is the last era of God's plan for us. We're living in the church age, or the Christian era. And so we're living in the last days according to that. But anyway, so one more thing in the way of introduction before we get to Matthew 24, but I promise you we're getting there today. So I just did a search this week. And I said, what are some Bible prophecies about the last days? And I'm not spending time on this other than just very quickly. I'll share with you what came up in that Google search. The Bible foretold many things that together would be the sign to identify the last days, Matthew 24:3. Know how many of these things that we're seeing that comes out of Matthew chapter 24. For example, war on a large scale, supposedly coming from Matthew 24:7. Famine from that same verse. Great earthquakes, disease, crime, diminished love of God, a global preaching work, and all of those, with the exception of that second one, disease, comes out of Matthew chapter 24. Now, I told you last week, you probably also want to reference Luke 21 and Mark 13 along with Matthew 24. And then here are the other two that came up with that search. Widespread apathy and ridicule, and all prophecies will be fulfilled according to Matthew 24:33. Now, are we living in the last days? As I said, yes. But we've been in the last days since Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. So, it's not because of what's going on now, although, as I said, the premillennialists, and that includes a large part of the world of Christianity, Christian. We believe like that. And so, Matthew chapter 24. I also ran across something here where Billy Graham, back in 1969, made the statement of the 10 signs that would indicate that we're near the end, ready for the end of time. And those 10 signs that he indicated came from Matthew chapter 24. Now, what I'm going to do today is show you why I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that's what Matthew chapter 24 is talking about. We laid the groundwork last week. Got several people in here today that wasn't with us last week. We laid the groundwork last week by going back and looking at what all the book of Matthew was written about, and what all happened all the way up through chapter 23 of Matthew. And if you see that, if you see all those warnings about the axe is laid to the root of the tree, the time was short for the Jewish nation. The destruction of the Jewish nation was at hand. And that's what we read about in Matthew chapter 24. So let's get into the chapter today and talk about that just a little bit. All right, Matthew 24. Following Matthew chapter 23, all of those rebukes there, and it says, Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Mark's account says, Do you not see all these great buildings? And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, the temple that's being discussed here, if you remember, Solomon's temple was destroyed. Then it was rebuilt. But it was rebuilt on a much smaller scale there. Well, Herod came in, and to try to gain favor with the Jews, Herod built this magnificent temple that was 15 stories high. Some of the rock in that temple, to build that temple, was about the size of this room. 37 feet long, 12 feet high, 18 feet wide, about the size of this room. Maybe with a little higher ceiling. That's the size of the stones that was used to that. And it was like marble, and it was so, it glistened so much that Josephus, in his account, said that from afar it looked like a great mountain covered in snow. So you can just imagine how the structure that we're talking about here, when Jesus says, you see these things? Not one stone is going to be left upon another. Well, to the Jew there and to the apostles or to the disciples hearing that, they probably equated that with being the end of the world. They couldn't imagine a time coming when that temple would be torn down to the point where all those stones would be not one left upon another. Now, in addition to the stones, everything that wasn't stone, the woodwork of the temple, was covered in pure gold. And so again, from afar, you could see the sun reflecting off the stones and off of that gold. It was a magnificent structure. Well, there's a little side note here, because that's kind of what caused the temple to be destroyed. When Vespasian was the emperor of Rome in AD 70, and his general of his army was Titus. And so the city of Jerusalem had rebelled against Rome, and so the Roman army went to shut down that rebellion. And so they encircled the city of Rome here for 5 months, cut off all the food, all the water, and basically the people inside the city gates there were in dire straits at the end of that 5 months. When the city fell at the end of the 5 months and they went in, Vespasian told Titus, don't destroy the temple. Don't burn the temple. And for whatever reason, I don't know. But the soldiers did burn it. Now, what happens when the wood starts burning and all of that gold that's covering the wood, what will happen to it? It melts, and it ran down in the cracks of all of those stones. And so Josephus' account says that every one of those stones were torn down, and not one was left upon another. And the reason was because the soldiers were after the gold. Isn't that an interesting side note there about that? So I want to notice a couple of things with you as we get into verse 3 here and get into the text. Jesus said, do you not see all these things? The phrase there, these things, you might want to circle that, because you'll find it 2 or 3 times throughout the text. As a matter of fact, it goes all the way back up to verse 36 of chapter 23. When he's pronounced all these woes on the Jewish nation, verse 36 says, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. These things. Now down here, he's referring to primarily the building, because he says, you see all these things, you see all these great things, you see all these things. And then let's go on down in verse 3 and note some more uses of that phrase. In verse 3, it says, tell us when will these things be? There it is again. Then go over to verse 6 and note, you will hear of wars and rumors of war, see that you're not troubled. All these things, there it is again. If you go down to verse 33, go to verse 33. So you also, when you see all these things, and then lastly in verse 34 it says, surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So he keeps referencing here these things, these things, these things. Now it's noteworthy after verse 35, you won't find that phrase anymore. It ends there in verse 35, and then verse 36 begins with but of that day. Talk about how that's changing the focus there a little bit later on. So let's go back down and pick up in verse 3. So Jesus has referenced these things. He says, see all these things? Well, the time is coming when not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, we continue with verse 3. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when these things be. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now again, for the disciples here and the Jews, for them to think of the complete destruction, the complete annihilation of that huge edifice, the temple, They equated that with being the end of time. And so they're asking this question here, and in their mind, they're considering it one question. When will this destruction be? When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Well, it's not one question. It's two separate questions. Because one of the questions deals with that destruction of the temple. That's one of the questions Jesus has got to deal with here. But that's not the end of time. We're going to see how that there's two questions here dealt with in chapter 24. So Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Now I want you to note in verse 4 the warning about being deceived. Matter of fact, I'll give you this at this time. Beginning with verse 4 here and running all the way down through verse 28, you're going to have some signs that he's talking about of when the destruction is going to happen of Jerusalem, and particularly of the temple. In verses 4 through 8, these are remote signs, not near. They're still far off a little bit. Then in verses 9 through 14, you're going to move to some near signs. Now it's getting closer. Time is getting closer by. In verses 15 through 28 are the immediate signs. But again, this is dealing with the destruction of the temple here. And note in each section, he warns them about being deceived. Look in verse 4 we just read. Take heed that no one deceives you. Go down to verse 11 in that second section with the near signs. He says, many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And then over in verse 24, you'll find false Christs and false prophets will rise up and great signs and wonders to deceive. Okay, now he's addressing the disciples here, but he's also addressing us a little bit. We're not talking about the destruction of the temple, but we're talking about being deceived, and the fact that if we don't study, if we don't dig and look into these truths here, like that millennial day theory that I shared with you, what about that? Well, you've got to get into the Bible and dig it out to see what's being discussed. So here we go. Let's talk about these remote signs in verses 4 through 8. Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled." I find it interesting here that he's comforting them in all of this stuff. He says, "See that you're not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Now you might want to note in your margin there, the end is not the end of time. We're talking about the end of the Jewish nation, which happens in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. But the end is not yet. And incidentally, these wars and rumors of wars, everything we're reading here in verses 4 through 8, if you read Josephus, now you know who Josephus is, right? Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he wrote several books about the things that's going on. These are secular writings here, but it's interesting to see what he said about all of these things. And in Josephus' writings, he said that as particularly in the reign of Nero in the 60s, right on the verge of AD 70, that there were a lot of wars in the Roman Empire, and he also made mention of that there were many people coming forward claiming to be the Messiah. So in verse 7, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." These are all remote signs, but they're the beginning of what's about to happen. Incidentally, if you want to mark in your Bible, there will be famines. mark Acts 11:28 there. And sometime remind me, and we'll go back and talk about that in detail, but that talks about the famines that were in existence during Nero's time. And there's a great Bible lesson surrounding that, the famines.
What was that scripture again?
That scripture was Acts 11:28. So the earthquakes, all of these things, earthquakes, there are many of those. I've got a note here in my margin that with earthquakes, there were many of those during Nero's reign. And so Jesus is saying all this. But now we switch gears here a little bit in verse 9. Verse 9 begins the signs that are nearer. Okay? And he says then. Notice verses 9 and following here, how many times you see the word then. Then they will deliver you up. Then many will be offended. Then many false prophets, etc. So now we're moving to signs that are a little bit nearer to that time, to the end of the Jewish nation. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Stop. Who's he talking to? Who's he talking to? I can't hear it. Say it loud.
Apostles.
Thank you. I have my ear days did. I just can't hear that. Yes. Who asked the questions over here? Look back in verses 1, 2, and 3 as we started all of that. Who's asking the questions? So he's talking to them. Now, are we going to be subject to persecution? Are we as Christians? Yes. We read over in 2 Timothy where it says, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. But that's not what's being addressed here. He's talking to the apostles here, and incidentally, of the 12 apostles, legend has it that out of the 12, 11 of them met a violent death because of their faith. John is supposed to be the only one that died a natural death, but he wasn't having a picnic in his last days. Where was he? He was on the Isle of Patmos, and he was exiled. So all of them, he's talking to them, and they said, they'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and they did. And you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and they were. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because, on through 14, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Now, verse 14 is a key verse here as we end this second section of near signs. Verse 14 says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Go back here just a minute. Look at the last bullet point right there. All prophecies will be fulfilled. Jesus said that the last days will be marked by the simultaneous fulfillment of all these prophecies. I'm going to go back one more. No, it's the last one on this one I wanted to reference. A global preaching work. Jesus foretold that the good news of the kingdom will be preached in all of the inhabited earth. What's verse 14 talking about, do you think? Spread of the gospel. And it clearly says that that's going to happen before the end comes. And Glenn, you said the end was, we were talking about the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, which happened when? When did it happen? AD 70. So the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world before AD 70. Do this way. Okay? Because here's the proof. Look at this. Now, okay, Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking. Jesus is AD 30, 33, sometime during that time. Look at what we find over in Colossians 1:23. You need to cross-reference this. Colossians 1:23, in the middle of a statement, he says, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Now that was written in AD 61 in Paul's letter to the Colossians, but what did he say here? He said the gospel has been preached, was preached, that's past tense. It's been preached all over the kingdom. So did it happen before AD 70? Yes, it did. Happened just like Jesus said it was going to, verse 14. So then the end will come. Now the end that's being addressed here is the first question. When is it going to happen that all those stones are going to be torn down and the temple's going to be destroyed? When is that going to happen? There's two questions. Make sure you understand. There are two questions. It says, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Two different questions. When are these things going to happen? When's the temple going to be destroyed and all those stones will be torn down off of one another? When's that going to happen? And tell us about the end of time. He's not addressing that question. He's addressing this one over here. He says, then the end will come. Cindy?
Is that their known world?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You have to, yeah. I mean, we're not talking about the unknown world, the Americas and the part that they're not aware of. Every creature under heaven. So that's what we read about in Colossians 1:23. All right, so let's begin this last section here. It's going to be the immediate signs. Verse 15 is another very important one. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, parenthetically it says, now whoever reads, let him understand. You got to understand what's being said here. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Pause. We'll deal with 16 in just a minute. Let's go back to 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, who's the book of Matthew being written to? Talked about that last week. The Jews. The Jews would be very familiar with Old Testament language. If you go back to Daniel chapter 9, you'll find the reference of the desolation, the abomination of desolation. We're going to talk about Daniel 9 in the coming weeks. What is the abomination of desolation? Written to the Jews here in the book of Matthew, written in language they would understand, the abomination of desolation. But in Luke's account, if you go over to Luke 21:20, matter of fact, hold your place. Let's do that. I think it would behoove us. Go over to Luke 21:20, and let's see how Luke describes it. Luke's not writing, his audience is not primarily that Jewish audience that would know the Old Testament. But here's Luke's account in chapter 21. Remember I told you, I said all three of these references in Mark, Luke, and Matthew need to be studied concurrently together, and it helps. So in verse 20, here's how Luke phrases that. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So the abomination of desolation back in chapter 24 of Matthew, verse 15, is referring to armies surrounding the city. And it's warning the Jews, the Christians, the Jewish Christians, it's warning the Christians of that day, when you see the city of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the end is very near. We're not talking about remote signs, we're talking about immediate signs. Know that it's about to happen when you see that.
Luke
Remember I referenced
Luke 21 what?
21:20. Remember I referenced Titus's army earlier and surrounding the city of Jerusalem and kept everything cut off for 5 months. It started in the spring, some people say around April or May, and then the actual destruction of Jerusalem and the temple happened in either August or September. So for about a 5-month period there, Titus's army surrounded the city. If you're familiar with Jewish history and you're in the city, what would you think? Something big is about to happen. It's immediate. There's the army. There's the abomination of desolation. Josephus and other historians write about this account. For some unexplained reason, Titus has got the city surrounded, and all of a sudden, he pulls back. Most historians think that he went to Egypt to deal with some uprising in Egypt, but he pulled back for a very short time. What did that give the believer time to do? Flee. Josephus says that 1.1 million Jews lost their lives in the destruction of Jerusalem, and not one single Christian. That's Josephus' account. Because they knew what to look for. They knew that this destruction was imminent here, and so when they saw that, they were looking for an opportunity. Now read verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. All right, question for you. If we're dealing with the end of time, is it going to do any good to flee to the mountains? You're not talking about the end of time. You're talking about the destruction of the city here, and the little gap that Titus, I'm sure he didn't realize that he was playing into God's hand. God was using him just like God does evil people all the time. But God used him to open that gap to let the Christians flee. And it says in verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That can't be an answer to the second question. It's got to be the answer to the first question. And another question here for you. We'll talk about the rapture later on in the series as we get a little further along. But how does all this apply if the rapture is true? We're talking about the end of time here and the rapture, and those faithful Christians are going to be raptured up, and everybody else is going to be left. This makes no sense. But if we're talking about the city of Jerusalem being destroyed in AD 70, it makes perfect sense. Read on. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Immediate. When you see an opportunity to get out, get out. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Verse 19, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Now question, why would that be woe to those?
Harder to flee.
Harder to flee. And the same thing in verse 20. And pray that your flight be not in winter. Why?
Harder to travel.
Harder to flee. Or on the Sabbath. Why? Because they locked the city down on the Sabbath and wouldn't let anybody out. You couldn't come in, you couldn't come and go. Travel was restricted on the Sabbath. Travel was difficult in winter. Travel would be particularly difficult if you were 9 months pregnant. And it said, just pray that it won't happen in those days. I stopped here at verse 21. I've got to make another note here. Here's another thing you want to note throughout this discussion. 2 questions were asked. In the first place, you have a reference to days, plural. See, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Now go to verse 22. And unless those days, plural, go to verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, all of those are referring to days, plural. It's a length of time here when all of this is happening, days. Now contrast that with verse 36. We're going to talk about how this changes the topic from the first question to the second question. Verse 36 says, but of that, I can't believe we're out of time, but of that day and hour no one knows. So we're gonna continue this, it's gonna take us more than 1 week to get through Matthew 24. We'll continue this, but let me just suffice it to say, at this point, he's dealing with two questions. He's dealing with the question of when are these things gonna happen? And that temple gonna be destroyed. That's what he's talking about here. And all of the days of plural, that all of this stuff is going on. But in verse 36, he changes the topic to deal with that last question. What was the last question? Lord, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of time? What does it say in verse 36? But of that day, single, no one else. So let's talk more about that. Here's one thing I want to tease you a little bit about for next time. Verses 29 through 31, a lot of people struggle with those verses. Talking about the tribulation and the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. A lot of people struggle with that, but there's an easy explanation. I can't tell you today.
What about 40? That's always complicated. We're starting at verse 40. That's always.
We'll talk about that too.
See, we're leaving town. I don't want to miss it.
Thank you so much for your time.
Online.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.